Jalon Walker, the pass rusher, is coming for that number one spot.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And guys, if you do not know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman. I've been covering the Atlanta Falcons for almost 2 decades, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP. Still going strong on this illustrious podcast for well over a decade. And I appreciate each and every one of you that go strong with me as everydayers. That means you make this podcast your first listen each and every day. And all you have to do to become an everydayer is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts to get the latest episode as soon as it is available. So today we are going to be joined later in the episode by Locked On Vols host Eric Cain to get the real scoop on all the James Pearce talk, pros, cons, all that stuff down in Tennessee. What really went on with him in the coaching staff. We'll talk about the new special teams maven that the Falcons signed today at linebacker as well. But first, I want to talk more about Jalon Walker, right? And we did the comprehensive scouting report on yesterday's episode. Please go check that out if you haven't. And unfortunately, because we had to get through so much information and try to get it under 35 minutes, and I think I wound up cutting like 44 or 5 minutes out of that episode to try to get it under 35 minutes or 36 minutes with ads. You know, some of the topics that I did want to explore and could explore more in depth, I didn't really get the opportunity to sort of touch upon it. And one of those things was what Jalon Walker's role is going to be in this Falcons defense. And we talked about it for a few minutes on yesterday's episode. And again, worth checking out if you haven't checked that out already to get sort of my thoughts on Jalon Walker overall as a prospect. But you know, that role that we expect Jalon Walker to have is kind of a dual role, right? Where the Falcons have said that he's going to be primarily an edge rusher. That's what they're going to focus on and you know, not let his versatility be a hindrance where they throw too much at him. And that makes total sense. And in what we suspect is going to be a 4-man front that features a lot of wide nine, Jalon Walker does fit in that. We'll talk more about why I think that's going to be something that the Falcons major in a little bit later. But I think the Falcons have also indicated that they're open to and do plan on, you know, dipping their toes in it. And we'll see, you know, if it's a full-on plunge, but dipping their toes with having that flexibility of asking Jalon Walker not only to just be an edge rusher off the edge, but also line up, you know, off the ball as a linebacker in pass rushing situations and take advantage of his skill set to really attack those A and B gaps, basically in the same way that the Falcons have utilized Kaden Elliss over the last couple of years, right? That you see a number of players being asked to do that due to the increased usage of simulated pressures in today's NFL. And for those of you not familiar with simulated pressures, it is basically when you rush 4, but instead of the 4 down linemen being the 4 guys that come as pass rushers, you send sort of replacement pressure from a linebacker or a cornerback, and then you drop one of those guys to replace that guy in coverage. So those what simulated pressures are. And I feel like Jalon Walker, and one of the things we talked about on yesterday's episode, especially when talking about him in comparison to Kaden Elliss, which will continue on today's episode, is that to me, that's really where Jalon Walker, I think, is at his most potent, watching the film from him in college, where I think he is going to create more problems for offensive linemen and blockers in terms of pass rush, being that sort of off-ball rusher than being a true edge rusher at this stage in his career. We'll see how he develops as an edge rusher, you know, with time and whatnot. And sort of getting into that sort of Kaden Elliss element, we talked about that on yesterday's episode, where Kaden Elliss, being a little bit more undersized, is much more effective as that off-ball rusher than necessarily a true edge rusher, talking about how his pressure rates over the last couple of years, according to Next Gen Stats, is basically 3 times higher when he's working as an off-ball linebacker than he is as an edge rusher. And the thing we talked about on yesterday's episode is that Jalon Walker, and part of the reason why Kaden Elliss is like that is because he's not the world's biggest guy. He's not the longest guy, right? And Jalon Walker is even smaller than Kaden Elliss is. And so you do wonder, is he also going to have that same issue when it comes to being an edge rusher at the next level? And then the reason why players like Kaden Elliss and Jalon Walker are better matching up against centers and guards and running backs in those situations than they are with offensive tackles is, it should be obvious why it's easier to beat a running back in pass protection than it is to beat any offensive lineman. That should be pretty obvious. But, the main reason is that offensive tackles compared to centers and guards typically are longer, and so when you have short-armed pass rushers like Kaden Elliss and Jalon Walker are relative to your average NFL edge rusher, that matters. Offensive tackles typically are better athletes than centers and guards are. And so therefore, if you're going to attack those guys with speed, as these undersized pass rushers often do, you need to be even more explosive than what, Kaden Elliss is when it comes to attacking those guys and really challenging those guys at the edge, right? And we talked about that, where when you look at Kaden Ellis's jumps in his 10-yard split and his 40-yard, the explosiveness metrics, right? He was 70th percentile as an athlete compared to other edge rushers, right? And we talked about how, when we compare Jalon Walker to having the potential of a Haason Reddick, who was 90th percentile in that regard. We talk about Micah Parsons, who's 95th percentile in that regard. And sort of where does Jalon Walker fit on that paradigm, right? Like he looks more athletic than Kaden Elliss, but is he as athletic as Haason Reddick? And it goes back to another conversation we had a couple of years ago when the Falcons drafted D'Angelo Malone. And the other thing I reiterated on yesterday's episode was that, Jalon Walker's pass rush profile in terms of how he won speed versus power versus all those various things was very reminiscent to D'Angelo Malone's coming out of Western Kentucky when I charted his stuff back in 2022. But one of the things about D'Angelo Malone I noted, because he was primarily a speed rusher that won with speed encounters at Western Kentucky, and D'Angelo Malone had a really fast 40 that I think was like 90th percentile among edge rushers. But when you looked at his jumps, he was like 75th percentile. And one of the things I said was, he plays more like a 70. The film says that he's more 75th percentile than a 90th percentile sort of athlete in terms of explosiveness. And I questioned whether or not that was going to allow D'Angelo Malone to be as effective as a speed rusher in the NFL as he was supposed to be, comparing that to, say, a Vic Beasley, that if you're going to be a one-note speed rusher, being a 75th percentile athlete in terms of your explosiveness is probably not good enough, while Vic Beasley was able to get away with it because Vic Beasley was like Haason Reddick and Micah Parsons in that 90th, 95th percentile sort of range. And again, that's the question with Jalon Walker. Where does he fit? Is he 80th percentile? And is that good enough to reach that threshold so that you can win consistently with speed? Or, is he, closer to Reddick and all those guys? And so we're hoping, let's say that Walker is in that sort of upper tier with the Reddicks and the Beasleys and the Parsons. And then when you couple that with the potential that he has of being that movable chess piece, not only can he win off the edge in that regard, but also you move him around and you can get him matched up one-on-one against centers, guards, and running backs. That is where you sort of really like the potential of a Jalon Walker in this sort of dual role down the road. Now, again, is he going to be that guy day one? Probably not, but that's what you're sort of visioning in. And, we don't like to make the comparisons to Micah Parsons because Micah Parsons is a one of 1,000 outlier, but like that's kind of the vibe that you get from Micah Parsons, where you see Dallas often moving him all around the formation to get him those favorable matchups. And if we are looking in at a time in the future where Jalon Walker is that sort of Haason Reddick level player off the edge, in addition to being that Kaden Elliss level player as an off-ball guy, that's a really potent piece for the Falcons pass rush moving forward. And so that's the real selling point for what you get excited about, the potential future of Jalon Walker. Now, as we discussed on yesterday's episode, there's a lot of hurdles and obstacles that the Falcons and Jalon Walker are going to have to overcome to get to that point, but that's what gets you really excited about Jalon Walker. And so the Falcons are of the opinion that, they're going to be closer to that in terms of how their team wins, that they can be able to feature that ability of Jalon Walker sooner versus later, because the Falcons believe, and Jeff Ulbrich said this with his own words, is that, they believe that they're going to be a potent passing attack that's going to score a lot of points. And that's going to allow them to play with leads. And that's going to allow this group of pass rushers to be in more favorable situations where they can pin their ears back and get after the quarterback. And that's going to be their formula for success, even if it's not going to be quite the same. It's basically the formula that the Indianapolis Colts had for many, many years when they had Peyton Manning at his height of his career, and they had that potent, explosive pass rush headlined by guys like Dwight Freeney and Robert Mathis that were undersized relative to what you wanted in the NFL. Now, again, is Michael Penix going to be Peyton Manning in his prime? Probably not, but one day we might get there. But that's kind of the formula for the Falcons, and whether you're buying that working this year is to each their own. But like you can kind of squint and you can say, okay, like I can see it coming together. There's a path for this passing attack to be as potent, that top 5 ish offense that the Falcons are hoping it to be. And then with this pass rush, can they get after the quarterback with those leads that they're holding? And the question that we're going to have that we had last year is like, are they going to be able to stop the run to get in those favorable situations, or are they going to have to rely heavily on that offense to give them those favorable situations? Those are all questions that we don't know at this point in time. But I do think, at least in year one, Jalon Walker in his dual role, you're probably not going to see him get as many snaps as I think people would assume based off of him being the Falcons' top pick, right? But I do think because of that potency that he has to play this dual role, I think he can be very effective even if it's in a limited role. Right? Like I'm not expecting Jalon Walker to get as many snaps as I think a lot of people assume. Coming out of the draft, I was like, oh, well, the Falcons going to be in this 3-4 front, and Jalon Walker is going to get more of the snaps than James Pearce, because James Pearce is going to be a designated pass rusher. But now, because of my belief that the Falcons are going to be more of that 4-man front, I think that's going to flip. And James Pearce is probably going to get a bigger role, and Jalon Walker is going to be more of that designated pass rusher that may only play, 25% of the snaps, or something like that. And for some of the reasons why I think the Falcons are going to major in that 4-man front, some of that comes from the sort of statements from Nate Ollie, the D-line coach, a couple of weeks ago that we broke down on the podcast. That attacking front sounds like it. The fact that the Falcons haven't been shown any interest in a nose tackle, which is not something that is necessary if you're going to play that 4-man wide 9 front than you would if you were going to play a 3-4, 4-3 under 5-man front. And the fact that Nate Ollie, including some of those statements that Nate Ollie said, that Zach Harrison and Brandon Dorlus are expected to play edge. And, that to me tells me that they know that they have some undersized edge rushers like Jalon Walker, like James Pearce, that aren't going to be necessarily good enough against the run. And so therefore they're going to do, play with those big ends at the position. And so, it'll be interesting to see how the Falcons treat it. Cause you've heard reports, and I've heard this through the grapevine, that the Falcons were strongly considering taking James Pearce at 15, and it's part of the reason what I've heard is why they went kind of down to the wire on the clock, that they used up all 10 minutes because they were going back and forth because they really wanted James Pearce, because James Pearce, and we'll talk about this more on the pod next week when we get to James Pearce's comprehensive breakdown, but James Pearce is more of that natural fit in that wide 9 4-man front, while Jalon Walker is more of kind of a fit in the 5-man front and playing this Kaden Elliss role. But I think the Falcons saw Jalon Walker. He was too good to pass up. And so they're going to be creative with how they utilize him, even if he isn't necessarily, they have the vision for him to be that every down player that I think they hope James Pearce can kind of grow into. And so it's basically the idea that 2 Kaden Ellis's are better than 1, right? And in theory, Jalon Walker is going to be a better version of Kaden Elliss. Right? We talk about Kaden Elliss, being 3 times more effective as an interior off-ball rusher than an edge rusher in terms of his pressure rate. You look at his PFF win rate as a pass rusher last year, he was 3rd in the NFL, right? Only behind Aiden Hutchinson, only behind Myles Garrett. That Kaden Elliss from a win rate standpoint was better than Nick Bosa, better than Micah Parsons. Now, no one, again, that's not as an edge rusher, but with the way that the Falcons utilized him with those simulated pressures, they were able to maximize his ability to consistently get after the quarterback. And so in theory, again, Jalon Walker is better than Kaden Elliss, should be better than Kaden Elliss. We hope he's better than Kaden Elliss. And so that's where we say, if Kaden Elliss was number 3 in terms of being the most potent pass rusher in the NFL last year, right, then Jalon Walker has the potential to come. He's coming for that number 1 spot. Aiden Hutchinson, keep your head on the swivel. He's coming for that number 1 spot. Myles Garrett, keep your head on the swivel. Jalon Walker is coming for that number 1 spot. So we will see if Jalon Walker can do so this upcoming season. We will continue today's Locked On Falcons talking about the most recent addition to the Falcons linebacker core and their special teams, and how much this moves the needle for the potential 53-man roster with the addition of Caleb Johnson as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. Now, the NBA playoffs are in full swing, and every night delivers highlight-worthy performances, major momentum shifts, and can't-miss moments. Whether it's a game-winning shot or that breakout player, there's never been a better time to get in on the action, and FanDuel is going to make it easy for you to get in on the action and stay in the game before tip-off and live during it. With player props, performance trends, and same-game parlays, fans have more ways to win than ever to play smart and win big. And my Wolves over Warriors in 6 prediction for FanDuel was looking a little rough after game 1, but it seems as things have settled in, and we'll see if they are pushing it. So, those are some of the many ways that you can win with FanDuel in terms of not only who's going to win the series, how many games they're going to win it, who's going to be the MVPs, all of that. And if you're new to FanDuel, it's the perfect time to sign up. Then head on over to FanDuel.com right now, and you can place your first $5 bet. And if it wins, you'll get $200 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, official sports betting partner of the NBA. So the Falcons did the thing that we thought they would do after rookie minicamp, which ended on Sunday. And on Monday, they signed one of their tryout players, which they have consistently done the last couple of years. And several of the players that they signed during this time of the offseason after that rookie minicamp, or trades that they made, like Brian Edwards was a trade. They signed Ross Dwelley last year, a number of guys over the last couple of years that, these May transactions do wind up being guys that are contributors to their team. I think Parker Hesse famously was, a May transaction originally for the Falcons. And, if you're a longtime listener to this podcast, we will always find a way to push the Parker Hesse agenda. And I know you guys are like, man, it's been a while since you mentioned Parker Hesse on the podcast, but it is what it is. So we got to get some more Parker Hesse mentions on the pod over the next couple of months. But the Falcons signed Caleb Johnson, a tryout linebacker for them, formerly out of Houston Baptist, a 5th-year NFL player. And this is often the case. The veteran guys that have played in this league, that have been around the block, tend to stand out in these tryout situations. But Johnson, is probably not really expected to contribute much on defense. He's primarily, over the last 4 years, been a major contributor on special teams for one season with the Chicago Bears, which was also the final year that a certain Falcons assistant GM named Ryan Pace was also the GM there. So once again, reason number 472, why Ryan Pace is actually the one pulling all the strings in the Falcons front office and not Terry Fontenot. But after Ryan Pace left, then Caleb Johnson wound up, leaving Chicago and going to Jacksonville, where he spent the last 3 years and has been a very productive special teams player. He's only played a combined 7 snaps on defense over the last 4 years of his NFL career, but has been a consistent performer on special teams, has 39 career special teams tackles over the last 4 seasons. And that's a significant number, because if you took everybody that was the leading special teams tackler for the Falcons over the last 4 years, which would have been D'Angelo Malone last year, Keith Smith in 23 and 21, and Kadero Hodge in 22, and combined their tackles in those respective years, that would combine for about 35 combined special teams tackles over the last 4 years. So the fact that Caleb Johnson has more than that tells you that this is a pretty productive and a really good ace special teams player. And so that's going to be his path to making this roster. If you listen to our 53-man roster projection last week, I projected 5 linebackers to make the team. That was Kaden Elliss, Divine Diablo, Troy Anderson, JD Bertrand, and Josh Woods for that 5th spot. And Josh Woods played almost exclusively on special teams for the Falcons last year. And that spot, if that player is going to make the roster, is going to exclusively be a special teams role for the Falcons in all likelihood. And so I think Caleb Johnson has a legit chance to take that job from Josh Woods. And if I was doing a 53-man roster prediction today, I would probably have Caleb Johnson on the roster over Josh Woods because of that special teams background. Now, to make room for Caleb Johnson, the Falcons cut Philip Dorsett. Some of you may be familiar with the name Philip Dorsett. It's like, oh, that's a name I haven't heard in a long time. Former first-round pick for the Indianapolis Colts in 2015. He didn't play with Peyton Manning, because Peyton Manning was in Denver in those years. But played with Andrew Luck. Speedy wide receiver out of Miami, never really made an impact in the NFL. It's kind of bounced around the league the last couple of years. I'm sure many of you didn't even realize that the Falcons scooped him up on their practice squad about midway through last season, when they were carrying like a bajillion wide receivers on their practice squad for some reason. was like they had like 5 wide receivers. They had like more wide receivers on the practice squad than they had on the roster. It was weird. But he was one of those players that they had scooped up. And being up there in age, having been in the NFL for a decade, being 32, 33, whatever age he is at this point in time, it felt like, his opportunities to make an impact in the league probably passed like 5 years ago. And so not a surprise to see the Falcons move on from him. So that's the latest on the roster moves. We'll see if more are in store for us in this month of May as we gear up for some of the other OTAs and eventual mandatory minicamp next month here in Atlanta. The Falcons do tend to make a couple of moves here and there during that period of time. So we'll see what's what on that. But we will wrap up today's episode talking with Locked On Vols host Eric Cain about James Pearce, and we'll do that to finish today's Locked On Falcons. Welcome back, everyone. We are joined by an illustrious guest. He is Eric Cain, who covers the Tennessee Volunteers over at Locked On Vols. And of course, we have Eric here to talk about the most recent Vol to become an Atlanta Falcon. That is none other than James Pearce Jr. Eric, my friend, welcome to the show.
Hey, appreciate you having me on.
So let's jump right into the James Pearce conversation. Eric, in your eyes, what are the Atlanta Falcons getting in James Pearce Jr.?
Yeah, James Pearce Jr. is an elite pass rusher in the making. He was certainly elite on the college realm in certain regards. He's quick twitch, really, really fast off the edge. His athleticism kind of jumps off the screen a little bit. As the years went on, I thought his rush defense got a whole lot better, setting the edge, forcing things inside. Early in his career, he was pretty much thought of as just a pass rusher, but I think he's grown in that respect to be more of a 3-down, defensive end, if you will. And I know that's not where he's going to start out in the NFL. He's going to be a pass rush specialist, but I thought he kind of, became more well-rounded as his college career went along. But good hands, quick twitch, athleticism, speed. I thought he did a good job of working on his moves as the years went along, but certainly a guy that's got a very, very high upside. He's put on a lot of weight throughout his college career. He probably needs to continue putting on a little bit more, but a guy that's got a high upside in terms of getting out to the quarterback.
Yeah, and, he was a 4-star recruit. You got to see some of those flashes early on as a true freshman, finished that year with 2 sacks despite only playing, like 60-some-odd snaps or something like that on defense that season. And so I imagine expectations were pretty high going into that 2023 season, his second year on campus. And, I just recently watched that Virginia game that he had in that season opener where he just kind of broke out and had 2 sacks and basically never looked back and wound up finishing the year with 10 sacks leading the SEC. And I'm just curious, as you go back to that moment, where is it like this sort of like, oh yeah, this is what he's living up. We're off to the races. He's living up to the hype at that point in time. What was that sort of seeing that 2023 breakout season for you like?
It was funny because that 2022 freshman campaign you referenced, I mean, those 60 snaps, those 2 sacks, I mean, that was all mop-up duty. Like, he was not a part of the rotation. It wasn't that, like, he was a bad football player. It was just he was raw. I mean, he wasn't refined. He wasn't ready. And so there was another true freshman, Leo is the position they call it at Tennessee, that, stand up outside defensive end, put the hand in the dirt, kind of hybrid. Joshua Josephs, he played a ton as a true freshman, where James Pearce was kind of regulated to, mop-up duty. But then those two kind of flipped a little bit. Joshua Joseph's still a really good player, played some, but the untapped potential kind of took over there for James Pearce as a sophomore. And it started in that Virginia game. And I know you said 2 sacks. I could have swore he had 3 sacks. I mean, whatever it was, or whatever the official stats were. I mean, he lived in the backfield, literally rent-free in the backfield that game. And, as that year went along, he had sacks that came in bunches. He had a big game against South Carolina, had a big game against, I want to say Alabama as well. And the sacks kind of came in bunches. And even, plays where he didn't bring the quarterback down, he was affecting the quarterback's throws. And I know one against South Carolina that year specifically kind of went to, it was Spencer Rattler. Clock was accelerated a little bit because of James Pearce. Forces a bad throw, leads to a pick 6. So he was impacting the game in a massive way. And but that Virginia game, I remember sitting there in the post-game press conference room, and we were asking questions about him and everything. And you had heard that just the unbelievable potential, the athleticism, but kind of seeing it all come together in one game, that was pretty cool. And then certainly, you knew that he was off to a great start, and you want to see if he could keep it up, and he absolutely kept it up that 2023 season.
Yeah, and in that 2023 season, you saw a lot of hype for him after the season going into the 2024 season. There was way too early mock drafts. A couple of them having potentially as the number one overall pick, a top 5, top 10 sort of guy. And obviously he didn't wind up being drafted that high. And I know this is something you talked about on Locked On Vols over the last year or so, but at least for the Locked On Falcons listeners who haven't heard your sort of assessment on it, how do you sort of, look at that sort of hype for James Pearce going into last season, and then, still had a productive year in Tennessee this past year, but sort of losing that hype over the course of the season? And, is that due to him having a down year, or do you think it was other circumstances that led to, him not necessarily coming into this pre-draft cycle with the same hype that he had a year ago?
Well, I thought all the hype that he was getting in the offseason, I mean, Pro Football Focus looked at him as the number one player, like, in the upcoming draft and all that. And I just kind of felt like from afar, it's like, man, like, that's so much hype. Like, he's never going to live up to that. And because he won't live up to that, everybody's going to think he's got a bust or a down year or whatever. But I mean, you go look at the Pro Football Focus pressure numbers and, quarterback hurries and all that. I mean, he's one of the national leaders. So, I mean, he was still affecting quarterbacks' play. And we get in the weeds here in those PFF stats, and he did a great job in that regard. And I think he still finished with 8.5 sacks, whatever it was. He still had a good year, don't get me wrong. But man, in terms of the sacks and in terms of the TFL numbers, I mean, early on in the season, James didn't really help himself out. He'd get back there in the quarterback and he'd wrap him up and then let him go. And it's like, man, you could have 3 or 4 more sacks to your name right now if you just brought the ball carrier down in the backfield or whatever. But he also didn't have Tyler Barron on the other side. And I'm not saying Tyler Barron made James Pearce. In fact, I think James Pearce made Tyler Barron a hell of a lot better football player in 2023. I think Tyler Barron was defensive end on the other side. I think he finished with 6.5 sacks that year, went on to Miami to finish his college career. That tandem was really, really good. But Barron wasn't there in 2024, so I think maybe that had something to do with it a little bit. So I think it was kind of a contributing factors a little bit. But at the end of the day, still affecting the quarterback, pressuring the quarterback. Those numbers were some of the best in the nation. And you still saw the athletic ability and the true pass rushing specialist that he is in 2024, albeit the numbers down just a little bit.
Yeah, that was something I noticed as well, where it's like, some of the sort of immediate, when you look at the sort of sack production and TFL production, those sorts of things that, is what people like to focus on, because obviously, those are the eye-popping plays. You see that production dip and you're like, oh, well, he had a bad year. And it's like, well, not really. It was basically the same. It's just probably, as you mentioned, being able to clean up a couple more of those plays and finish a couple of more of those plays due to the rest of the rotation probably would have helped add to that total. But, the other talking point with James Pearce, and Eric, I'm sure you've heard it a ton over the last couple of months, which is those sort of character concerns and maturity concerns and all these issues surrounding James Pearce, to the point that, a lot of criticism has come from the Falcons' decision to trade up into round 1 to get James Pearce, despite all the talent that we're talking about him possessing, is because, you hear through the grapevine, various NFL teams did not have him on their draft board. And it's not because James Pearce, did any sort of despicable activity off the field. It's just simply people question his love of the game and all that stuff. And you hear all these anonymous scouts, talking to the Tennessee Vols coaching staff and sort of, getting this feedback that isn't necessarily painting James Pearce in the most positive light. And so, as someone who's covered that team and this coaching staff and James Pearce the last couple of years, what is your read of all that sort of pre-draft issues with James Pearce?
I mean, so much of it, in my opinion, and maybe this is just because I cover Tennessee, it is what it is, but I mean, so much of that I feel like is overblown. I mean, was he an altar boy? No. Was he a young life leader at the University of Tennessee? No, he was not. But there's a lot of players that weren't like that are productive football players. And I mean, to your point, did he ever do anything that was just so horrendous or anything off the field? No, he did not at least to my knowledge. He had one run in, with the traffic stop where he was not cooperative and all that. But I mean, I think he had a expired license or whatever the case is. I mean, to my knowledge, that's the only thing that he's had on record. And I'm not saying that that's good. You need to always be cooperative in those situations. But he didn't get into a lot of trouble. Now, Was he a headache at times? Was he trying to do his own thing at times? I'm sure he was. There's a lot of players that are like that at a lot of different programs. But I really thought that the stigma that he carried around throughout this pre-draft process was just so heavy when, like, sure, there's a little bit of validity to it, but, like, it's not like he's alone in this regard. I thought it was a little unfair at points in times. I thought it was, like, too much. But end of the day, he showed up. He practiced. He played. His teammates liked him, and the coaching staff was able to get a lot out of him. Now, did they get the most out of him? I don't know. But they got a lot out of him. He's a first-round pick, and he was obviously being talked about as being the number one overall draft pick, last summer. So I thought it was a little bit much, but certainly I'm not going to act like there's nothing there. But you look around the NFL, there's a lot of guys that have perceived character issues, and hopefully he stays out of the news in that regard, and he's a stand-up citizen and all that. The Falcons obviously believe in him. They like him. They like him as the player and the person. They wouldn't have traded up in the first round to go get him. But I think that was so overblown, it's not even funny, in my opinion.
Yeah. So, Eric, any sort of parting thoughts that you want to give the listeners about James Pearce?
Yeah, I think he's a good player, and I think his best football is still in front of him. I know we got a glimpse of it in 2023 and certainly a couple of times in 2024. Again, I think he's a work in progress. he's tall, like he was lanky when he got to Tennessee, put on some good weight still, as I mentioned earlier. Kind of becoming a well-rounded, end player and forcing everything inside, defending the run and all that. So I still think his best football is in front of him. But again, going back to what I said, so athletic. I know NFL, right? They're all athletic, but so quick, so athletic. His hands usage is really, really good. And he's just that motor is going to help him in the National Football League. So I'm really excited to see kind of how all this translates and what he looks like and what his role could be early in his career. And then to see kind of how that grows for the next couple of years. But certainly I think he's a first-round talent. And, growing up in Charlotte, coming to Tennessee, and now being in Atlanta, still in that same region, of home. And so I think that'll help him as well.
So, guys, that's going to do it for us here on today's Locked on Falcons. Tomorrow, I think we'll touch a little bit more on Michael Penix, revisit some of the things that I think Derek Klassen said that were a little controversial, but I don't think are that controversial when you understand the context in which Derek was talking about those things. And so that will be what's in store for you on tomorrow's episode. And we'll see what else comes up that, tickles my fancy. So continue to make Locked on Falcons your first listen so that I can tickle your fancy. Pause. So you can do so by checking us out on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. And of course, for your second listen, check out the Locked on NFL Scouting podcast, where Joe Marino and Kyle Krabs are giving you the lowdown on roster building, who won the draft, who set their young quarterbacks up for success. All that is there for you on Locked on NFL Scouting, wherever you get your podcasts. It's all part of Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day.